Today I will be mostly talking about this book I published together with some other people titled Spaces for Criticism. I was hoping that the publishing house, Valise, would have shipped a few books to here so that you could look at them and perhaps buy them, but that didn't quite work out. But I think they send in an ordering form so that you can order the book without shipping costs. Also, I brought some essays of mine that were recently published by Best in The Hague, and you can take them for free if you are fast, because I don't have one for everyone. But I won't be talking about that essay today. The overview of my presentation, what I will do today, is first tell you a bit about the book series, Arts and Society, of which this book was part. And this is not just meant as a sort of advertisement, but also to show you a bit of the kind of art theory and research and sort of criticism that I myself am involved in. Next, I will talk a bit in a broader sense about this book, Spaces for Criticism, Shifts in Contemporary Art Discourses, to give you the background of well, why we wanted to make this book and the kind of discussions that this book is trying to intervene in. And then I will zoom further in, so to say, to the opening essay of that book, which was written by myself and Pascal Gielen, who is a colleague of mine in Groningen, an art sociologist. And this essay was called Between Criticism and Critique, Towards an Espacement of Criticism. And that story is made up of the following components. First, I will talk about the notion of space-time compression. And we are looking basically at the way in which this space-time compression, what the consequences of this space-time compression is for the field of art in general and for art criticism specifically. So we will look at what this, how art criticism has evolved as a result of this space-time compression, and how a new sort of international and atemporal art criticism has emerged from this development, and what the specific problems are that are attached to this kind of criticism. We then, in this essay, try to respond to these developments by what we call a de-historicization and an espacement of criticism, which was also the title of today's lecture. And I will come back to that, of course, what I try to say with these kinds of words. And then finally, at the final part of the essay, I will look at what was basically the source of inspiration for the title of the book. So the book is titled Spaces for Criticism, and this title was inspired by a small fragment from Walter Benjamin, from his book One Way Street, titled This Space for Rent, and how this inspiration came about and what Benjamin is saying in this fragment. I will come to that at the end of my lecture. So, and by the way, if you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to ask them, and otherwise we can have a discussion at the end. So first, about the book series Arts and Society. This is a book series published by Valise publisher from Amsterdam, and set up together with my home University of Groningen, the Research Center Arts and Society, together with Fontis School of the Arts in Tilburg, where Pascal was a lecturer too. Pascal Gielen is also the series editor, and each title in this book revolves around one specific subject. So here are a few examples: community art, institutional attitudes, which is about the contemporary state of art institutions. Teaching art in the neoliberal realm, which is about art education in times of neoliberalism. Arts education beyond art, which Pascal made together with another colleague of mine, Barend van Heusden. No Culture, No Europe, which is about the problem that Europe may be a political unity to a certain extent and an economic unity, but has no sort of shared cultural space, and that this is the problem that we were dealing with in that book. And finally then, on the far right, Spaces for Criticism, Shifts in Contemporary Art Discourses. Now, all these books, like I said, refer to a specific topic, and this topic is then viewed from different angles, both from the art field, from art scholars, but also practitioners, and people from arts policy. So all these books are textbooks, compilations, well, they really are meant to show a certain discussion revolving around these kinds of topics. Most of the books also contain interviews with people who have thought about these topics for a long time. For instance, the book on community art contains an interview with Antoni Negri, and the book on teaching art in the neoliberal realm contains an interview with Richard Sennett. So this is also a way to introduce to a broader public these authors who sometimes are themselves quite difficult to read, and to introduce them to a broader public. So the aim of these books are also not just at an academic public, but also at the art field, art students, to really introduce them in a certain discussion, a certain debate. And it's also really meant to show different voices within such discussions. So the books are not one unity arguing for one thing only. It's for instance, the community art book is, I think, a very good example of that, because most books on community art are either written from the perspective of the believer, so to say, the one who really think that community art is a very good thing, or the very critical views. And this book on community art really contains both of these perspectives, so both the critical views and the believer, so to say. So this book series has been running now for a few years, and with the 5-year anniversary there was even made a beer series based on the book series. I think that's what you get when a Belgian guy is leading the book series, that everything eventually will have to be translated into beer. But today I will be talking mostly about this book, Spaces for Criticism, and this was made by myself and Pascal Gille, together with two scholars from the Academy of Fine Arts of Vienna, namely Ruud Sonderegger, an Austrian scholar who I knew from when I was studying, when I did my PhD in Benjamin and Adorno, and she was part of my reading committee. She is a professor of aesthetics at the Fine Arts Academy of Vienna. And Susanna Milewska, who was a colleague of Ruud in Vienna, and who was also very much involved in art criticism, especially in Eastern Europe. And she also joined in, and together we made this book. And the book was meant as a sort of response to the whole debate that was going on for a few years on the crisis of criticism, or the end of criticism, or the death of criticism. So I see that some of you also joined the lecture I gave yesterday at the university, and there I gave a bit more context about that debate. That has been going on for a long time, that criticism is at an end, that there is this feeling of crisis, and that there is no place for the critic anymore. And we feel very reluctant to join that swan song, so to say, of criticism, and we want to come up with an alternative. And rather than speaking of the end or the death of criticism, we wanted to talk about a displacement of criticism. So criticism is not at an end, but is heading in different directions, you might say. So instead of asking, that also meant that instead of asking what criticism is, we wanted to know where criticism is. Criticism is heading in new directions, it's going to new spaces, so to say, and we wanted to look at these new spaces for criticism, hence also the title. So you might say that what we are trying to do in this book is sort of mapping a topology of criticism. What are the spaces where criticism today is happening, if indeed it is disappearing in other places and spaces. So yesterday I already thought that today we see that there is indeed less place for criticism in perhaps the traditional spots like newspapers and so forth. But in our view, this doesn't mean that criticism is disappearing, it's just going in different directions. Our book is made up of 3 parts, and these 3 parts all point to different kinds of displacements or different kinds of shifts in our discourses. So we distinguish between 3 of those shifts. The first are spatio-temporal shifts. So this is basically also what I will be talking about today. Namely this influence of time-space compression on the field of art criticism. But also these spatio-temporal shifts can, of course, refer to the way in which the West isn't no longer the self-evident center of the art world. So what happens if indeed the art world becomes global, and what does this mean for the field of criticism? This is part of this first part of the book. Then the second part of the book is dealing with institutional and professional shifts in criticism. What do we mean by that? Now, you see today that the critic, as a sort of traditional profession, is becoming increasingly blurred with other professions. So today you also see that critics are part of the university world, or critics are part of the art institutions, or critics are also a curator, or even artists themselves become their own critics. So in that way you see that this whole profession of the critic isn't as self-evident as it might have been earlier. And in this second part we are trying to track what those kinds of shifts mean for the field of criticism. And of course here also the influence of the market is very important. So what happens if the market begins to dominate the global art world? What does that mean for the traditional dealer-critic system, so to say? And in the third part of the book we deal with media and identity shifts. Well, media, I think, is evident. It refers to the fact that criticism, of course, isn't only happening in the traditional newspapers anymore, but also increasingly on websites and blogs, and even the likes on Facebook can be considered as a very, well, lowbrow kind of criticism, you might say, but also IMDb or Goodreads or all kinds of online forums, of course, have their own ways of art criticism, and this also, of course, has an important influence, I think, on traditional ways of criticism. So how do these things interact, the mainstream and the non-mainstream, the way of the fragmentation that also is the result of digital criticism. So all these kinds of things are discussed in the third part of the book. And with regard to the identity shifts, we were also thinking about feminist criticism, queer criticism, and this is also part of the discussion in this third part of the book. So today I will be talking about mostly about the first part of the book, of which my essay together with Pascal Gille is part. But perhaps in the discussion we can also come back to these other parts, which perhaps for you are also interesting. So, then I come to talking about the first essay of this book, Towards an Espacement of Criticism. We start this essay with Walter Benjamin again, and then not with the fragment I mentioned earlier, but with Benjamin's essay, Der Erzähler. Here is Benjamin playing a game of chess with Bertolt Brecht. I'm not sure whether you know this essay by Walter Benjamin, but it was based on a review of works by the Russian author Nikolai Leskov, but he used this review, so to say, to give a more extensive view on what for him storytelling meant. And because Walter Benjamin thought that in the day when he was writing, in the 1930s, that there was a sort of decay of storytelling. This art of storytelling that was very much part of the traditional oral way of transferring stories was falling apart in his view. So I will tell a bit of the background. He distinguishes between two different types of storytellers, namely the trading seaman and the saddle tiller. So the trading seaman is the one who goes to foreign places and traditionally would encounter all kinds of adventures and monsters, and so to say, and he would come back to his fellow citizens and he would tell of all the strange things that he would have encountered, and this was what made him such a good storyteller. So this was the traveling seaman. And then the other type of storyteller was the saddle tiller, the old farmer, you could say, who would know all the people from long ago and who would know all the stories from his hometown and from back in the day, so to say, and he could tell you precisely who was living there and etc. and all the native stories, so to say. Now, what these two types of storytellers have in common is that they have a sort of authority that is based on distance. And so the trading seaman obviously has traveled a lot, he has seen a lot, and through the distance that he has traveled, has this authority by which he can transfer his experience to other people. And of course the saddle tiller also has this distance, but then a distance in time. He has, sort of say, he covers the distance in time that other people cannot cover. And this is also why, according to Benjamin, this art of storytelling is slowly crumbling, so to say, because this distance is disappearing. And Benjamin was writing, of course, in the days when journalism was steadily emerging, and he said that, well, in the days of journalism, everyone is so to say up to date, but no one has anything interesting to report to one another anymore, because this journalism is indeed spreading facts all over the world, but isn't really transferring experience. So the world is changing in such a large pace, Benjamin argued, that even the experience of a grandfather to his grandson, so to say, is no longer of much value, because in the meantime the world has changed to such an extent that the lessons of the grandfather are no longer that valid. So stories, the traditional way of transferring experience, is becoming increasingly valueless, according to Benjamin. Now, we saw a sort of analogy between what Benjamin was telling about the storyteller and the critic. And even with these two types, you see a sort of analogy with the traditional critic. So, on the one hand, you have the traditional traveler critic, like, for instance, figures like Madame de Stael or Huysmans, who would travel abroad and would go to see exhibitions and then tell his fellow citizens about what all the beautiful artworks that he saw there abroad, and well, the other people, even if they would never go there, would at least get this experience of beauty transferred through this art criticism. So this was the sort of traveling seaman type of critic. And on the other hand, you had the critic as a historian, so figures like Ruskin or even someone like Baudelaire, who knew the tradition of art and tradition of painting in his own country, and would compare the new works, so to say, with the tradition, with the art history. And I think that in the same way that Benjamin says that the art of storytelling was becoming increasingly problematic, we argue that in the same way the art of art criticism is becoming problematic, precisely through this disappearing of distance in space and time. And this is what we are trying to argue on the basis of this concept of time-space compression. So in modernity, distances in space and time disappear, and this is precisely what David Harvey called time-space compression. So I will talk a bit more about that concept right now. Perhaps for most of you it's obvious or common knowledge, but still to give a bit of a background for this story, I think it can help. So Harvey is basically arguing that the modern age is ruled by speed. Whoever can cover the most distance in the shortest time is the one who rules. And Harvey is not the only one who's arguing this. You also see this, for instance, in the work of Paul Virilio, or recently in the work of the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa. So you see, for instance, a development from the horse-drawn carriage to the steamship to the airplane to wireless internet. You see an increasingly fast covering of space in time. And hence, modernity is characterized by this dual process of globalization and mediatization. I'm forgetting my PowerPoint a bit, I believe so. Okay. However, this is not merely a sort of increasing quantitative process, a sort of linear development, because at a certain point, this sort of quantitative development turns into a
qualitative change. And this was once formulated nicely, I think, by the Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman in his book, I think this is from Liquid Modernity, and he there describes the transfer from what he calls heavy to light modernity. So heavy modernity was this modernity that indeed the hardware modernity, so to say, of ever developing ever faster machines that can cover space. And light modernity is the moment, Bauman argues, where space and time become completely nonsensical, so to say, that you can cover, it's so fast that space and time lose their meaning. So I will quote from Bauman. He says the following: "In the era of software, of light modernity, the effectiveness of time as a means of value attainment tends to approach infinity, with the paradoxical effect of leveling up, or rather down, the value of all units in the field of potential objectives. The question mark has moved from the side of the means to that of the ends. If applied to the time-space relation, this means that since all parts of space can be reached in the same time span, that is, in no time, no part of space is privileged, none has special value." So the last part of the quote is most important. Of course, if we can reach everything in no time, everywhere in no time, no place has special value anymore. So this means that distances in time and space increasingly lose their meaning. And in our essay, we basically try to look at the question, if we indeed can be anywhere in no time, what does this mean for art and art criticism? So this whole idea of the authority through distance that I was talking about earlier, that was part of the traditional criticism, becomes very problematic, of course, if everyone can travel to the Venice Biennale with cheap EasyJet ticket flights and so forth, or with a click of the internet you can see all artworks you want. So both the traveling critic and the critic as historian begin losing their authority, you might say. So what are the consequences for the art world? And in its wake, what are the consequences for criticism? So, to start with the art world, what we see, I think, in the last years in the international art world are indeed these consequences of time-space compression. And here you will have to excuse me for talking in a very general sense. Of course, that you can blame me for that, but it's always a bit necessary when you want to zoom out a bit. And if you look indeed at this international artwork, you see what, with a reference to Rem Koolhaas, you might name generic art. As you might know, Rem Koolhaas talked about the generic city, with which he meant that in the age of globalization, cities would become more and more alike, and be more and more alike shopping malls and how do you call it? Airplane. No. Airports, indeed. So transit spaces. And they would be more and more similar, and this was what Rem Koolhaas a bit provocatively, of course, called the generic city. And in the same way, you might say, also a bit provocatively, that we are heading towards the age of generic art. Now, you might say that art already in modernism was heading in that direction, that of course modernism was, of course, already had these kinds of international pretensions. And you see indeed a sort of development from an age in which you had very clear-cut national styles, well, the Dutch school, the Italian school and so forth, towards the internationalism of modernism. But still, I think that in the case of modernism, you might still distinguish certain national types. So, for instance, if you look at pop art, this is of course a international art style, but also it had a specific couleur locale. It was in a sense very American, in the same way that the Neue Wilde was very German and Arte Povera was, although it was modernism, it was also very Italian. So I think only in the recent decades you see the emergence of this global art, sort of biennal art you might say, also with sometimes with these labels like international installation art. And indeed, if you would walk into a museum of contemporary art anywhere in the world, I think it would be quite difficult to determine where you were at that moment if you wouldn't know, to determine whether you are in Sao Paulo or in New York or in Paris or in Venice. So I think if you would have to judge purely on the basis of the art present there, it would be very hard. And of course you also see this emergence of what I just mentioned, biennal art. The biennals are popping from the ground like mushrooms throughout Europe, so to say, and of course this also has a very important drive of city marketing and cultural tourism behind it, but often it's completely devoid of any couleur locale, so to say. So you see this delocalization of art. And in the same way that you see this delocalization, you also see a de-historicization. I just already referred to the term contemporary, Museum of Contemporary Art, and this already points also to, I think, an interesting development in the last decades in the international artwork, namely this development, which is already, of course, going on since the 1980s, from the modern to the contemporary. Why aren't we talking about the modern anymore, but about the contemporary, and what do these labels mean? It's, I think, an interesting thing to look at this word contemporary and what it tries to pretend, so to say. So the modern, of course, had this pretension of critically relating to the past, critically relating to tradition, and also heading into a specific direction into the future, quite a clear direction or clear focus on a specific course. And I think that part of this time-space compression that I was talking about is a sort of collective loss of memory, sort of eternal present that Frederick Jameson already was talking about in his book on postmodernism, while at the same time this past is omnipresent. Right? Take the internet again and as an example. It's both that the past can come to you in a mouse click, so it's everywhere, but it's also so fugitive that it's also part of this eternal present. And I think that's also part of this concept of the contemporary, because I always wonder what do we mean when we talk about contemporary art? What are we exactly saying? And often we aren't saying much more than it's just what's happening now, right? The contemporary is what's happening in the here and now at this moment. And in that sense you also see in contemporary art a sort of suspicion against this traditional linear art history that was still part of modernism, the traditional causal relationships between artworks or between art traditions, and therefore a sort of suspicion towards traditional art history per se. And you see this in the shift from the modern to the contemporary, and more on an institutional level. You also see this in the shift, which I already referred to before, the shift from the museum to the biennale. So the museum, of course, is still part of this tradition. It has a collection, and it has the responsibility to conserve. While, of course, the biennale doesn't have any collection. It's only what you might call the eternal recurrence of the new. But even the new itself, in a sense, is jeopardized in the emergence of this kind of biennale art, since the new itself is, of course, as also Boris Groys mentioned, a sort of relational concept, or a sort of negative adaptation to tradition. So if we are no longer clear about tradition, then how can we be clear about what's new? So this is, I think, again, very generally speaking, a way to characterize the contemporary global art world, from the modern to the contemporary, from the regional to the global, from the museum to the biennale. And in our essay we talk about the global art world as being ruled by what we call the law of immediacy in non-places, a bit provocatively, and the Guggenheimization of art. I think you can imagine what we mean by Guggenheimization. This is a picture of the design for the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi, indeed. And you see, of course, that there is this criticism directed at Guggenheim for placing these kind of gigantic UFO-like buildings here and there, and starting their own franchise in a way that might be similar, might be considered similar to the way that McDonald's began to rule the international food world. So, by the way, this shift from the museum to the biennale is also discussed in other texts, mainly also by Pascal. He wrote a book on the biennale, and also in the book Institutional Attitudes, he also talks about the biennale as a sort of post-institute, which doesn't have this vertical character that the traditional art institutions still had. And it's part of this flat world, so to say. So, now let's move from the art world to the world of art criticism. And by the way, I will constantly shift, so to say, between these two concepts of time and space. And also when I'm discussing art criticism, I will first talk about space and then about time, and how these components develop in art criticism. So what are the consequences for this space-time compression for the world of art criticism? And can criticism perhaps be a sort of counter force towards this generic art? Now, at first sight, this will be very unlikely, precisely because the critic, in a sense, is himself part and parcel of modernity, right? The critic was always the one also to look over the border and to bring people in contact with a modern public sphere and with different traditions. And in that way, this internationalization is part of the fabric, you might say, of art criticism. Nicolas Bourriaud, the French theorist and critic once talked about critics as agents of delocalization. So in that sense, we shouldn't expect a clear-cut answer from criticism towards this delocalization. So what are the developments, again very generally speaking, we can look at in this international context with regard to art criticism? So like I said, this critic was already a sort of international figure that always was looking for different contexts and different art worlds. But now this, in a way, seems to backfire on the critic. And how does this happen? Well, in the first place, you see that there is emerging a sort of criticism that might be called footloose. It becomes detached from a local context, and especially you see this in what I call IAE. Anyone has an idea where this stands for, this abbreviation? No? It stands for International Art English. It was a concept we didn't make up ourselves. It refers to a publication of two scholars, Rule and Levine, which was published in Triple Canopy a few years ago. And they point at this phenomenon of international art English, which they consider as a sort of, which is most similar, they say, to a sort of badly translated French, which has its own lexicon, like aporia, biopolitical, transversal, and all kinds of specific prefixes like para and proto and post and meta and hyper and so forth. And also typical word transformations and manipulations. And here I will quote a short bit of their text. Visual becomes visuality, global becomes globality, potential becomes potentiality, experience becomes experienceability. So I think most of us will recognize this. This is indeed something that we often encounter in this international art world, this sort of international art English, which is here again in the beautiful word cloud made visual. And when today criticism is attacked, it is often because of this kind of jargon, right? So a kind of jargon that seems to be completely detached from local practices, detached also from a broader public sphere, a sort of generic art speak, you might say, that is basically only speaking to itself, you might say. And I think this is one of the problems that is haunting contemporary art criticism, in the sense of delocalization. But also I think you see a problem with regard to the temporal dimension. So here I will turn again from the spatial dimension to the temporal dimension of art criticism. So like the traditional museum, the institution of the museum, the critic, of course, also was traditionally part of this sort of vertical axis of art, a sort of historical consciousness of art. And here you see also a sort of de-historicization of art criticism, which comes along with the dwindling influence, I think, of art historians in art criticism, and the emergence of all kinds of theory in art criticism. So art history is increasingly displaced by art theory, which is often quite ad hoc and produced also by the artists and the curators themselves. They often make use of the jargon of philosophers and sociologists, and even today when you go to a museum of contemporary art, you see, I think, more books of Hart and Negri or Zizek or Zygmunt Bauman there than you see traditional art historians. So the question is of course whether this is a problem, and well, I should be the last one to complain about this, because I'm, of course, my background is in philosophy, so I'm not a trained art historian. But you see this this discussion sometimes that art historians complain about these intruders, so to say, in their fields, and which don't have enough knowledge of art history, but are sort of say intruding in their field. And the question is, of course, whether this is a problem, and if so, how to deal with this problem. So how to deal with this footloose criticism, the delocalization and the de-historicization of criticism. So this is part of the thing that we are trying to argue in this essay. We're trying to find a sort of answer to these developments, and we do that through what we call rehistorization and espacement. And this is our own bit of international art English, you understand. So in the first place, I think we should realize that there is no turning back. So we shouldn't be that nostalgic, I think, for the traditional critic. Like I said, the critic himself is part and parcel of this development in modernity, is himself this agent of delocalization. And therefore also, rather than talking about the crisis or the death of criticism, we want to talk about this displacement of criticism. But on the other hand, we also didn't want to sing the praise of this sort of new, brave new world of networking, nomadic people, hybridic critics traveling around the globe, so to say, because I think also this network discourse has for a long time been first and foremost stimulated by a sort of commodification and neoliberalization of the art market and also of theory itself. That's also, by the way, part of this essay, if you are interested. So we especially want to investigate how we can reintroduce a bit of verticality, so to say, in this increasingly flat world of art and art criticism, and we do this by means of these two concepts of rehistorization and espacement. So when we are talking about the bringing back of history in art criticism, we think of a very specific type of historicization, namely the one that Jameson mentioned when he wrote "Always Historicize." Frederick Jameson thought that this was the only trans-historical imperative, actually. So why does Jameson think that historicization is so important? Well, in his view, it's so important because it counters the appearance of obviousness, of self-evidence, of naturalness, or of necessity of the present. So historicization is always the realization of contingency, that it could always have been different. And history in that sense is the learning school of contingency. It shows that everything could have been different, and therefore everything also can be different. And in that sense, when Jameson is talking about historicization, he's basically talking about it in the complete opposite sense, you might say, of when Hegel was thinking about it. Namely, of course, in Hegel you have this sort of necessary natural development of history, a sort of necessary course And Jameson is, of course, arguing precisely the other way around, that history shows us precisely the contingency. But when Jameson is saying always historicize, it's also different from the traditional art historian. So the traditional art history that would provide this historical context to a work of art. Because of course Jameson is arguing not just for providing a art historical context, but connecting the history that you are talking about with contemporary experience. So art in that sense is never about its place in art history, but rather its place in world history, in a complete cultural context, so to say. So in that sense, when Jameson is saying always historicize, and when we plead for a rehistorization of art criticism, we argue that the critic should ask the question, what does this work tell about the world that we are living in, about the kinds of experience that we encounter, about the historical development per se that we encounter in our world. So in our essay we refer to this criticism as a modern criticism, and we do this in a provocative sense, in that sense that of course modernism has for a long time been considered as passé, precisely because it has this sort of linear pretension. But when we refer to modern, we refer to the way in which Michel Foucault uses this word modern in his text on enlightenment. And it's also used as a sort of counterforce to this notion of the contemporary, of this eternal present. So I will quote a bit from Foucault. I hope this will make it a bit more clear. So Foucault says, for the attitude of modernity, the high value of the present is indissociable from a desperate eagerness to imagine it otherwise than it is, and to transform it not by destroying it, but by grasping it in what it is. So modern in this sense is different from the contemporary. So the contemporary, like I said, is often just what is happening in the here and now, and in that sense also takes the here and now as a sort of given, while modern in the sense that Foucault is talking about here is always considering the contemporary otherwise than it is, so in its full contingency. This would also mean then that for such a critic, art is never only about art, but indeed again also about this experience of the way we live today, the world we live in. And precisely because of this, I think that this shift from the traditional art historian as a critic to the theorist or the jargon of philosophers and sociologists should not only be criticized, but can also be welcomed in a specific sense. Of course, when it's only the woolly jargon, then it's very problematic. But as long as these philosophers or theorists like, well, the one I mentioned, like Hart and Negri or Bauman, are referring to a very deeply felt contemporary experience of the present, then this mixture of art history and art criticism with these kinds of theories can be very productive, I think, when it's done in the right way, of course. It does offer, I think, the opportunity to connect the aesthetic experience with social experience and cultural experience. So, this, of course, also has its consequences for, again, for the whereabouts of criticism. So I was now talking about the historical dimension of criticism, and now I will turn back to the place or space dimension. Indeed, if this kind of operation of criticism is to be successful, critics, of course, should not only debate within their own safe walls of the art institutions or of the academia. And indeed, I think that it's a responsibility also for critics to actively look for the crossroads with politics, education, culture, etc. And this, I think, is part of what we mean when we say that this displacement of criticism that I've been talking about should be answered with an espacement of criticism. And indeed, this is our own bit of international art English, a word that we made up ourselves, which I think isn't really existing, but was based on a text by Michel de Certeau, the French scholar. So, as you might know, Michel de Certeau makes this distinction between place and space. So place is lieu and space espace in France. And place he considered as something fixed, as a sort of stable location that you can point on the map. While space is always something fugitive, something that you have to perform yourself, so to say. Like a public space, it isn't necessarily an existing place, but it has to be constantly performed and actualized, so to say. It only exists as the effect created by a sort of activity, a sort of action, a sort of practice. So to make this a bit clearer, I will quote from Michel de Certeau from Practices of Everyday Life. And there he writes the following to make clear this distinction. He says, a place is the order of whatever kind in accord with which elements are distributed in relationships of coexistence. A place is thus an instantaneous configuration of positions. It implies an indication of stability. Stability is important. A space exists when one takes into considerations factors of directions, velocities, and time variables. Thus, space is composed of intersections of mobile elements. On this view, in relation to place, space is like the word when it is spoken. That is, when it is caught in the ambiguity of an actualization. In short, space is a practiced place. And the last part is of course crucial. Space is a practiced place. So that means that space indeed exists only as a practice. It must be shaped every time anew in that practice, time and time again. And indeed, I was already referring to public space. So public space is in that sense neither restricted to one place nor to one medium. What counts is indeed the act of being public, so to say. And Simone was just showing me around the vicinity here a bit, and you showed me the square in front of the museum, and you said that it didn't really work as a public space because it was too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer, and that it wasn't really used. So you might say that it might be a place, but it isn't a public space, because for it to be a public space, it isn't only enough to be a square and to have a certain architecture. It has to be performed every time and again. So I think this is very nice to show this difference between place and space. And I think this is also part of what is often referred to as this crisis of criticism, namely that criticism perhaps has been too much relying on its places while lacking in creating spaces, so to say. So criticism perhaps has been too much in the safety of the walls of the professional art world, and And by now it's becoming clear, of course, also through things like budget cuts and so forth, that we can no longer rely on these traditional places. And that we should indeed constantly create these spaces for criticism. So in that sense, criticism, the space for criticism is always something that needs to be performed. And this is also why I think it is useless to talk about the death or the end of criticism, because in that sense you consider criticism as indeed something fixed to a specific medium or to a specific place, while I think that the challenge of criticism is to indeed create ever anew these kinds of spaces, and also to reach out to new audiences and to tune into their experiences, so to say. And indeed this also means that the shift is not only between place and space, but also between criticism and critique. This was the title also of this essay, Between Criticism and Critique. I'm not sure how it is in Slovene, but both in German and in Dutch, the word for criticism is the same as the word for critique. It's also in Slovene. And I think that in English these words have grown apart, so to say. There is a clear distinction between art criticism and more social, cultural critique. But I think now the challenge is to put these back together, and this is basically what we are arguing for also. So, I'm not sure how with the time.
You're okay.
Okay. Then I will come to the last part now of my lecture with, this is a thing I forgot apparently. Also a sort of illustration of the difference between space and place. This is a part of a photo book made by a Dutch photographer. And he photographed all these kinds of paths that were made by people themselves, performed by people themselves. In Dutch they are called elephants' paths, because of course they are the same kinds of paths that are made by elephants through the savannah. You might say that this guy is just lazy, but it's also of course a sort of act of subversion, that you aren't letting yourself be told where to walk, but you take your own path. But of course this path is only existing as long as people are still using it and indeed are performing it. So this was another illustration of de Secto's argument. So then finally, to bring me to the conclusion, I promised you that I would tell where our title came from. I already told you that it came from a fragment of Walter Benjamin from the book One Way Street. And this fragment is titled in German Diese Flecke sind zu vermieten. And in English this is translated as this space is for rent. As you might know, the book by Benjamin is compiled of all kinds of short fragments, and the fragments mostly refer to signs in the streets and advertisement signs and so forth, and he uses these signs as sort of headers under which he comprises his own theoretical reflections. And in this fragment, this space is for rent, he reflects on the situation of the critic in his age, and he says that already in the 1920s then there was of course already this crisis of criticism, and people argued that criticism was at an end. But the notion of this space is for rent seems to imply that it's for rent for another critic, for a new critic to take indeed this space of the older critic. But I will first quote from the fragment. So Benjamin writes the following: "Fools lament the decay of criticism, for its day is long past. criticism is a matter of correct distancing. It was at home in a world where perspectives and prospects counted and where it was possible to take a standpoint. Now, things press too closely on human society. The unclouded, innocent eye has become a lie. Perhaps the whole naive mode of expression is sheer incompetence. Today, the most real, the mercantile gaze into the heart of things is advertisement. What, in the end, makes advertisement so superior to criticism? Not what the moving red neon sign says, but the fiery pool reflecting in the asphalt. Now, when I began studying Benjamin and when I stumbled upon this fragment, I thought this was the most puzzling and most provocative and most, well, mind-blowing quote I came along. Because what is he trying to say here? Is he really proposing to replace criticism with advertisement? That seems absurd, right? Because well, Benjamin, as you might know, was a Marxist philosopher who wasn't necessarily in favor of capitalist propaganda and advertisement. So it would seem very unlikely that he would actually propose this. So is he then completely arguing the other way around, or is it pure irony? Well, I think, at least this is how I have read this quote, that he is indeed seeing something very appealing in advertisement, that there was indeed something very attractive for him in advertisement, namely that it was so very much in the street. It really reached out to people. It hits you in the face, so to say, and it is indeed performative. It's not just about what it says, but also how it says, right? The medium is the message, so to say. And I think that Benjamin is, in a way, thinking that criticism can learn something from that. And this is, I think, also what he was trying to do in One Way Street, to sort of say, use the power of advertisement for criticism. So I think that using this quote from Benjamin as inspiration, I think that criticism can think of ways of adopting this sort of performative force of advertisement, indeed its ability to reach new publics, to occupy new spaces, to reach out in new ways, but deploy this as a sort of counter force against this omnipresence of uncritical advertisement, which of course with the global art market is completely overwhelming us. So the public sphere, as I said, is in constant development, is in constant flux, and in that sense also criticism should be developing with it, which does not mean that it should swim with the tide, but indeed to, again, talk with Benjamin, be never consistent but always radical. And yeah, I think I will leave it at that. Thank you for your attention. And well, I hope that you have perhaps some remarks or questions, and that we can have a discussion on the things I've been telling. Thank you.
Could you perhaps give an example of this espacement that you were suggesting, like a concrete example? Is it possible?
Of this espacement?
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like, would you call it like, for example, a certain group of critics that have developed their own style or something? How could you, I don't know, I would like to have some concrete...
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, one example I can think of is part of the book in Spaces for Criticism, in which was of a gallery in
in Stuttgart, which became part of this sort of action group against a city reform. So that there was this gigantic city reform in which the center of the city would be drastically restructured and in a sense also gentrified. And this gallery, which was ran by art professionals and critics too, made of their gallery at the same time a sort of meeting place for this action group. So there was this sort of mutual influence of this, the action group for, against the city reform, which began using all kinds of aesthetic means, so to say, and at the same time this space for art, which became also a space of critique in the more social and political way. So I think this is a way of, well, both literally and figuratively opening up the doors for social issues.
But that would mean then the criticism or critique is becoming an active, so it takes in a way a place of art, to be trying to be active in the space. So not just reflecting, but also making actions. So
yes, yeah, indeed.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in that sense you see also a blurring of boundaries there between critics and artists, critics and activists. Yeah, in that sense. But this is just one example. Other examples I think are perhaps less, what would be less immediately activist are also critics like, well, for instance, someone like Frederick Jameson, who is not merely an art critic or a cultural critic, but also a social critic. So in that sense, the kind of criticism that inspires me the most is the criticism in the tradition of critical theory that is always also cultural criticism and also social criticism, so to say. Yes?
But it still uses the newspaper and books media. I mean, this kind of printed media, but also all the digital media that you, so it not necessarily as an action, it can be written, but uses all sorts of media.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Of course. I'm definitely not arguing that art criticism shouldn't be written anymore. So I'm very much in favor of that. But I think it can happen in various ways. Of course, you today also see the video essay, for instance, as a sort of new medium for criticism. And in our book is also an interview with a DJ. Quite a famous queer DJ. I must admit I never heard of her before, but she's quite famous in the United States and Japan, and she also considers her DJing as a form of criticism in the sense that she mashes up existing things and tries to reflect on questions of queer identity and so forth. So this can also be a way of bringing criticism on the dance floor, even, you might say. Of course, these are the more unconventional ways of displacement of criticism. I think also written criticism can behave in different ways. Well, perhaps what I think is an interesting development, which was a Dutch newspaper who decided not to have their reviews of exhibitions and theater plays and so forth only in one section of the newspaper, but throughout the newspaper in places where it would fit or where it would matter. So then you see no longer as
okay, here we have economy, and here we have foreign news, and blah blah blah, and here we have sport, and then art at the very back often of the newspaper. But that art is scattered throughout the newspaper, so to say, and you also see that these artworks aren't in their protected place somewhere in the museum only, but they are part of the world, and also reflecting already themselves on this world that they are part of. So I think this would also be an interesting example of the way that these traditional walls are crumbling down. And of course, the people writing those reviews are still the critics, but they have a different position within the newspaper.
And this is a daily newspaper.
Yes, yeah.
And it works like that for how long?
It was quite recent, so I think it's only for 1 year or so.
And it works.
Yeah, for
People
now.
are satisfied.
Advertising is still pouring in.
Well, of course, that might also have to do with it that criticism, of course, is often less visible than the gigantic advertisement for the big exhibitions and so forth, who are often more in the front of the newspaper than the art reviews. Yeah.
So this would be then like one form of this last one, this scattering of reviews all over the newspaper is one like very presentable form of espacement.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
I can imagine this quite in spatial terms. Thank you.
Now, there was, perhaps in a different context, there was an interesting example also a few weeks ago. Pascal, my colleague, he became, unfortunately, he's going to leave Groningen, and he becomes a professor in Antwerp. And he becomes the head of a sort of PhD program in the arts called ARIA. They had this huge event as a sort of startup for ARIA, but it was organized not at a university, but in an empty an empty shop in a huge mall. So this was a really interesting situation where you had this mall where people were shopping and so forth, and there was this one place or space, I should say, where there were art performances and critical debates and lectures and so forth, and the people would come in with their shopping bags, and then they would think, well, what can I buy here? And then suddenly there was this theorist talking about art criticism and so forth, and the strange thing was that it worked, that people actually stopped and sat down and listened and sometimes even asked questions and then left again. And I think this was also an example of this work of espacement that sometimes perhaps you should do a symposium, not in academia or in an art school, but well, perhaps out in the street or in a shopping mall indeed. I thought that this was an interesting example, and it was based also on a sort of intervention art that of course also is bringing art not only in the museums but also out in the street. And perhaps you might think of ways in which criticism can be a sort of analogy of that.
Okay,
Any
thank you.
further questions?